Sarah Mitchell never imagined that the night she pressed her ear against her husband's study door, heart pounding, wine glass trembling in her hand, she would hear the sound that would shatter the life she thought they had built. It wasn't a business crisis. It wasn't another billionaire trying to bring David Mitchell's empire to its knees. It was her husband, crying, not quietly, not gracefully, but with the kind of agony that only comes from breaking somewhere no one can see. And when she heard him whisper, "How do I tell her? How do I destroy everything she believes about who I am?" Sarah realized that the man she had loved for 16 years was hiding a truth so heavy it had finally crushed him, and was about to crush her too. Hi, my wonderful family. Welcome back to your own favorite channel. As we go into the full story, may the Almighty God help every heart listening find the courage to face what hurts in silence. May the weight you've been carrying alone finally meet the light of honesty, and may the walls built from fear, shame, or pride slowly crumble, so healing can take their place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from. Now the full story. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that wealth could insulate a person from pain. Standing in the marble-floored kitchen of their penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, watching the Chicago skyline glitter against the November darkness, she had convinced herself that their life was untouchable, perfect. The kind of existence that other people only dreamed about while scrolling through social media at 3 in the morning, wondering where their own lives had gone wrong. Her husband, David Mitchell, was a legend in the financial district. At 42, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents: tech investments, real estate developments, pharmaceutical breakthroughs. His name appeared in Forbes, in the Wall Street Journal, whispered with reverence in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. When he walked into a room, conversations paused. When he spoke, markets moved. But that November evening, as Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and listened to the distant sound of sirens wailing somewhere in the city below, she had no idea that everything she thought she knew was about to shatter like the delicate crystal in her hand. David had been different lately, distant. She had noticed it over the past 3 weeks, the way he would stare out the floor-to-ceiling windows of their home, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying a weight she had never seen before. He came home later, spoke less, smiled rarely. When she asked him about it, he would wave it away with practiced ease, blaming stress from a merger, complications with a deal in Singapore, the usual pressures that came with managing billions of dollars. Sarah had accepted these explanations because accepting them was easier than confronting the alternative. Because in 16 years of marriage, David had never lied to her about anything that mattered. Or so she had believed. It was a Thursday when everything changed. Sarah had spent the afternoon at a charity luncheon in the Gold Coast, one of those obligatory events where wealthy women gathered to write checks and pretend their donations absolved them of the guilt that came with excess. She had returned home around 4, kicked off her heels, and settled into the reading nook in their bedroom with a book she had been trying to finish for months. That was when she heard it, a sound so foreign, so unexpected that at first she thought it might be coming from outside, perhaps from a neighbor's unit, though their penthouse was designed to be soundproof. But no, the sound was closer. It was coming from David's study, the room at the end of the hallway that he had claimed as his sanctuary when they first moved into this place 8 years ago. The sound was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere profound and broken. Sarah's first instinct was to run to him. Her hand was already on the doorknob of the bedroom when she heard his voice, muffled but audible, speaking to someone on the phone. She froze. Every instinct screamed at her to give him privacy, to respect the boundaries they had always maintained in their marriage. But something in the raw agony of his voice held her captive, rooted her to the spot just outside his study door. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened. David's voice was barely recognizable. Stripped of all the confidence and authority that usually defined it, he sounded like a child, lost and terrified, and drowning in something too large to comprehend. "I don't know what to do," he was saying, his words broken by sobs. "God, Michael, I don't know how to tell her. How do I tell her this? How do I destroy everything she believes about who I am?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Michael was David's older brother, living in Portland, a high school teacher who had chosen a modest life far removed from David's world of excess. They spoke maybe once a month, brief conversations about family and weather, and nothing of consequence. Why would David be calling him now in this state? 16 years, David continued, his voice cracking. 16 years of building this life with her, and it's all been built on a lie. Not a lie, exactly, but an omission so massive it might as well be the same thing. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe. Her mind raced through possibilities. An affair? Another family? A terminal illness? Each option felt like a knife sliding between her ribs, but she forced herself to keep listening, to understand. Before she reacted, "The money, Michael, all of it. Everything we have, everything I've built, it all started with his money, Dad's money." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. David's father, Robert Mitchell. A man David claimed to have cut ties with when he was 19. A man David said he hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. A man whose existence had been reduced to brief, bitter mentions over the years. According to David, Robert had been an absent father, a cruel man who had abandoned David and Michael and their mother when the boys were young, leaving them to struggle in a cramped apartment in Pilsen while he pursued business ventures that always failed, relationships that always soured. David had built his entire identity around being self-made. It was his origin story, the narrative he told in interviews and keynote speeches. He had started with nothing, worked 3 jobs to put himself through Northwestern, built his first company in a studio apartment with maxed-out credit cards and relentless determination. That story had inspired thousands. It had inspired Sarah when they first met at a charity gala 16 years ago, when she was a young attorney and he was an up-and-coming entrepreneur who talked about his hunger like it was a superpower. But now, through the door, David was saying something different. "He showed up at my office 6 weeks ago," David said, his voice hollow. "Just walked right past security like he owned the place. You know what he said to me? He said, 'I've been watching you, David. I've been watching you become everything I should have been. And I'm proud. After 23 years of silence, he shows up and says he's proud. Sarah heard David blow his nose, heard papers rustling, heard the creak of his leather chair as he shifted. I should have thrown him out. I should have called security. But Michael, when I looked at him, I saw myself, not physically, but in his eyes. That same hunger, that same desperation to prove something to the world. And before I knew what I was doing, I was asking him to sit down. I was offering him coffee. I was listening. There was a pause, and Sarah imagined Michael on the other end, saying something she couldn't hear. He told me he had money, David continued, a lot of it. Some investment he made in the 90s that finally paid off after decades. $7 million, Michael. He said he wanted to make amends. He said he knew he couldn't buy back the years, couldn't erase the damage, but he wanted to help. He wanted to invest in my first company, the one I was trying to get off the ground back in '99. Sarah's legs felt weak. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the hallway floor, her expensive dress pooling around her, her carefully styled hair falling into her face. She didn't care. Nothing mattered except understanding what was happening on the other side of that door. I took it, David said, and the words sounded like a confession. I took his money, Michael. I told myself it was just business, that I would pay him back, that it didn't change anything about who I was or how I got here. But I used his $7 million to leverage another $20 million from investors. I used it to acquire my first real company, to make my first real fortune. And from there, everything grew. Every success, every deal, every billion-dollar acquisition, it all traces back to that initial $7 million from the father I swore I'd never need, never forgive, never accept anything from. Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. The revelation felt surreal, impossible. How had he hidden this? How had he carried this secret for 6 weeks, coming home every night, kissing her hello, sitting across from her at dinner, making love to her in their California king bed, all while carrying this crushing weight? Sarah doesn't know, David said, answering the question Sarah hadn't asked aloud. She thinks I'm completely self-made. She thinks I'm the man from the magazine profiles, the kid who fought his way up from nothing. But I'm not, Michael. I'm the son of Robert Mitchell, and everything I have, everything I've accomplished, it's all built on his foundation. On the foundation of the man I've spent my entire adult life claiming I didn't need. Sarah heard David's breathing become ragged again, heard him struggling to compose himself. He died yesterday, David said, and the words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Heart attack. He was in Seattle for business. They found him in his hotel room this morning. He was 68 years old, Michael. 68. And I only started speaking to him again 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks to undo 23 years of silence, and it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. The pieces began to fall into place in Sarah's mind. The distance, the distraction, the weight David had been carrying. He had been rebuilding a relationship with his father in secret, processing decades of abandonment and resentment, trying to reconcile the man he had become with the help he had accepted from the man he had sworn to never forgive. And now that man was gone, leaving David with questions that would never be answered and a truth that would reshape everything. I have to tell Sarah, David said. I have to tell her that our entire life together has been built on something I lied about, not directly maybe, but through omission, through letting her believe a story that wasn't completely true. She married a man who claimed to be self-made, who wore his independence like armor. What's she going to think when she finds out that man doesn't exist, that I'm not who she thought I was? Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, not tears of anger or betrayal, though those feelings were present, swirling in the chaos of her emotions. These were tears of recognition, of understanding, of finally seeing her husband not as the invincible titan she had built him up to be in her mind, but as a human being struggling with impossible choices and the weight of his own mythology. She thought about her own story, the one she rarely told anyone. Her own father had died when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone on a teacher's salary. Sarah had gotten through college and law school on scholarships and loans, working nights and weekends, convinced that she had done it all herself. But that wasn't completely true either, was it? There had been her aunt who paid for her LSAT prep course, her mother who had remortgaged the house to help with her first year of law school when the loans fell through, her college roommate's father who had connected her with the internship that launched her career. Nobody was truly self-made. Everyone stood on someone's shoulders, whether they acknowledged it or not. The difference was only in what we chose to see, what we chose to remember, what we chose to claim as our own achievement. David was still talking, his voice quieter now, exhausted. The funeral is Sunday, he said, in Portland. I want you to help me plan it, if you're willing. And Michael, I need to ask you something. Dad left everything to me. Another 7 million, his house, some investments. I don't want it. I can't take anything more from him. I want to split it with you. You should have half. You were his son too, and you never got anything, never got the chance for reconciliation that I squandered. Sarah heard Michael's response as a murmur through the phone, heard David's sharp intake of breath. You're sure? Michael, you're a teacher. You have student loans. You and Rebecca are trying to have kids. This money could change your life. Another murmur. Then David laughed, a broken sound that held no humor. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what he would have wanted, isn't it? For us to be whole again. For us to be brothers without his shadow between us. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting on the floor. She smoothed down her dress, wiped her eyes, took a deep breath. Then she knocked on the study door. The silence from inside was immediate and absolute. She knocked again, gently. David, can I come in? More silence. Then, quietly, "Michael, I have to go. Sarah's here. I'll call you tomorrow about the arrangements." The door opened. David stood there, his eyes red and swollen, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled in a way that would have been unthinkable in any other context. He looked at her, and she saw the moment he registered that she knew, saw the fear flash across his face, the instinctive move to close himself off, to protect the vulnerability he had spent a lifetime learning to hide. But Sarah didn't give him the chance to retreat. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, held him tight against her chest, felt his entire body shudder with the force of emotions he had been holding back for weeks, maybe years, maybe his entire life. "I heard," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about your father." David's arms came up around her waist, gripping her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and uncertain. He buried his face in her neck and cried, deep, racking sobs that shook them both. Sarah held him through it, saying nothing, just being present in a way she hadn't been in years. When had they become so distant from each other? When had their marriage become about maintaining an image rather than sustaining a connection? They stood like that for a long time, until David's crying subsided into shaky breaths and exhausted silence. Finally, he pulled back, looking at her with eyes that held a question he seemed afraid to ask. Sarah took his hand and led him to the leather couch in his study, the one they had picked out together when they first furnished this place, back when everything was new and full of promise. They sat down, their knees touching, their hands intertwined. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, "from the beginning." And David did. He told her about that day 6 weeks ago when Robert Mitchell walked into his office, about the conversation that had stretched for 3 hours, about the revelation that his father had been following his career from a distance for years, attending conferences where David spoke, reading articles about his successes, never reaching out because he believed he had forfeited the right to be part of David's life. He told her about the money, about the decision he had made at 26 years old to accept help from the man he had spent years resenting, about the guilt and shame that had lived in him ever since, growing with every success, every accolade. Every time someone called him self-made, he told her about the lunches they had shared over the past 6 weeks, meeting at quiet restaurants far from the financial district where they might be recognized. About learning that his father had become sober 15 years ago, had rebuilt his life, had tried multiple times to reach out but had always stopped himself, convinced that David and Michael were better off without him. About the regrets his father carried, the years he wished he could reclaim, the apologies he offered that could never be enough but were offered anyway, raw and sincere. And he told her about the call yesterday morning, the one from a hospital in Seattle, the sterile voice of a stranger explaining that Robert Mitchell had been found unresponsive in his hotel room, that despite the efforts of paramedics, he had been pronounced dead at the scene, that David was listed as his emergency contact and next of kin. About the numbness that had followed, the inability to process that his father was gone, that the reconciliation they had barely begun was now over, finished, before it could truly start. Sarah listened to all of it, and with each revelation, she felt her understanding of their life together shift and recalibrate. The anger she had expected to feel never materialized. Instead, there was sadness. Sadness for David, for the burden he had carried alone. Sadness for Robert, for the relationships he had damaged and could never fully repair. Sadness for all the ways people hurt each other and themselves, trying to live up to stories they believed they had to embody. When David finally fell silent, emotionally spent, Sarah spoke. "Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day?" she asked. "Not in your vows, but after. When we were alone in the hotel room before the reception, and you were pacing around in your tuxedo, nervous about the speeches." David shook his head slightly, his brow furrowed. "You said, 'I'm terrified that one day you're going to realize you married a fraud, that underneath all of this, I'm just a scared kid who has no idea what he's doing. And I told you that everyone feels that way.'" That we're all just scared kids, pretending to be adults, hoping no one notices we're making it up as we go along. She squeezed his hand, forcing him to look at her. David, I didn't fall in love with your origin story. I fell in love with you. The man who remembered my coffee order after our first date. The man who cried watching stupid movies. The man who would spend hours on the phone with your brother, talking about nothing just because you knew he was lonely in Portland. The man who came home every night and asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. But the foundation of everything, David said, his voice rough. The money, the success, the life we've built, it's all tainted now. All based on something I wasn't honest about. Sarah thought about this carefully before responding. She thought about all the stories they tell themselves, all the narratives we construct to make sense of our lives. The truth was always more complicated than the stories, always messier, always harder to fit into neat boxes that made sense to other people. Every fortune in this city has blood on it somewhere, Sarah said quietly. Every success story has chapters that get conveniently edited out. Your father gave you $7 million 25 years ago. You turned that into billions. You created thousands of jobs. You revolutionized entire industries. You funded medical research that saved lives. Did your father's money give you a head start? Yes. Does that erase everything you accomplished with that head start? No. She paused, making sure he was hearing her. The question isn't whether you're self-made in some pure, absolute sense. Nobody is. The question is what you do with the advantages you have, acknowledged or not. And David, you've done extraordinary things. You've changed the world. Your father's money was the seed, but you grew the garden. You can honor both truths at once. David leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm scared of what people will think. If this becomes public, if the story changes, everything changes. The speaking engagements, the profile pieces, the mentorship programs I've started for underprivileged entrepreneurs. It all becomes a lie. Or it becomes more honest, Sarah countered. Maybe the kids who look up to you need to hear that even people with advantages struggle, that accepting help doesn't make you weak. That reconciliation is possible, even when it's complicated and imperfect. Maybe that's a better story than the one you've been telling. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city lights twinkle through the windows of the study. Somewhere out there, millions of people were living their lives, carrying their own secrets, struggling with their own versions of David's dilemma. The gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. The distance between our public faces and our private truths. Finally, David opened his eyes and looked at his wife. Will you come with me to Portland? To the funeral? Of course, Sarah said immediately. I'll cancel everything. We'll go together. Even though you never met him? Even though this whole thing is messy and complicated and probably going to be awkward as hell? Sarah smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in hours. Especially because of that. David, we've been married for 16 years. We've attended hundreds of events together, smiled for thousands of photographs, played the role of the perfect power couple so many times I sometimes forget what we look like when we're not performing. Maybe it's time we showed up somewhere as just us. Messy, complicated, imperfect us. David pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Probably not, Sarah said, and felt him laugh against her, a real laugh this time, one that held hope instead of despair. But you're stuck with me anyway. For better or worse, remember, this is definitely the worst part. We'll figure it out. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet of David's study while the city hummed its eternal song outside. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of dealing with Robert Mitchell's death, of planning a funeral for a man most of David's world didn't know had existed. They would navigate the complicated emotions of grief mixed with regret, of love that had never been simple or easy. They would figure out what to do about the money, about the story, about the truth that would eventually need to be told. But tonight, they just held each other. Two people who had spent years building a life together. Now, learning that life had always been built on a more complicated foundation than either of them had wanted to admit. It wasn't the fairy tale version, the clean narrative of self-made success and perfect marriage, but it was real. And real, Sarah was beginning to understand, was worth more than perfect had ever been. Later, as they lay in bed together, David's head resting on Sarah's shoulder, he spoke into the darkness. "I called him Dad," he said. "2 weeks ago, at our last lunch. I hadn't called him that since I was 7 years old. He asked me about a deal I was working on, and I was explaining it, and I said, 'Dad, you would have loved this part.' And he just stopped, put down his fork, looked at me with these eyes that were so full of everything he'd never said, and he touched my hand across the table. Didn't say anything, just touched my hand." Sarah felt tears sliding down her face again, soaking into the pillow. "I'm glad you had that moment," she whispered. "I'm glad you got to give him that, even if it was brief." "Me too," David said. "God, me too." They drifted into sleep like that, exhausted and emotionally raw, but somehow closer than they had been in years. Outside, Chicago continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its towers and streets. But in this one apartment, in this one bed, 2 people had found their way back to something essential, something that had been missing beneath all the wealth and success and carefully maintained images. They had found their way back to truth, and truth, as painful as it could be, was the only foundation worth building on. The funeral in Portland was small and quiet, attended by fewer than 20 people. Michael and his wife Rebecca were there, along with a handful of Robert Mitchell's colleagues from the consulting firm where he had worked the last 15 years of his life. A few members of the AA group he had attended religiously every Tuesday and Thursday evening, a neighbor who had become a friend. David stood at the front of the modest funeral home, looking out at these strangers who had known his father in ways he never would, and he spoke about reconciliation, about second chances and the courage it takes to forgive both others and yourself, about the ways we hurt the people we love and the ways we sometimes, if we're very lucky, get the chance to begin healing those wounds. He didn't mention the money. He didn't explain that his father's investment had been the foundation of his empire. Those details were private, for family to know and the world to learn about only if and when it became necessary. What mattered, what David wanted these people to understand, was that Robert Mitchell had been loved at the end, that he had died knowing his son had forgiven him, had welcomed him back, had given him the gift of being called Dad one more time. Sarah stood beside her husband, her hand in his, and watched him become more fully himself than she had ever seen him. Not the confident CEO, not the billionaire entrepreneur, not the self-made success story. Just a man grieving his father, acknowledging his complexity, honoring the messy truth of their relationship. After the service, Michael pulled David aside in the parking lot, while Sarah talked with Rebecca. "He would have been proud of what you said in there," Michael told his brother. "Not the public David Mitchell proud, but real proud. Dad proud." David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "I'm keeping some of the money," Michael said suddenly. "Not for me, for a scholarship fund in his name, for kids whose parents are in recovery, trying to rebuild their lives, kids who need a second chance because their parents are getting one." I think that's what he would have wanted. "That's perfect," David managed. "That's absolutely perfect." The brothers embraced in the cool Portland morning, their mother's sons, their father's legacy. 2 men trying to do right by a complicated history and an uncertain future. On the flight back to Chicago that evening, Sarah and David sat in the first-class cabin of a commercial airline, something they hadn't done in years, having grown accustomed to private jets. But David had wanted to fly commercial this time, had wanted to be among other people, normal people, people whose lives weren't isolated behind walls of wealth and privilege. Sarah held his hand as they flew over the country in the darkness, and she thought about the phone call that had changed everything. The sound of her husband crying, the revelations that had shaken the foundation of their life together, the truth that had been hiding beneath years of careful narrative construction. She thought about how close she had come to never hearing that phone call, to never knowing this side of David, to continuing through their marriage in the careful, distant way they had been moving for years. How close they had come to losing each other while still living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, going through the motions of a partnership that had forgotten what true partnership meant. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, noticing her distant expression. Sarah turned to him. This man she had married 16 years ago. This man she was only now truly beginning to know. "I'm thinking that I'm glad I listened at the door," she said honestly. "I'm glad I broke our unspoken rule about privacy and boundaries. I'm glad I heard you at your most vulnerable, your most real. Because that's when I finally saw you, David, not the version you show the world, but you. And I like you so much better than the image." David smiled, a sad, grateful smile that held everything he couldn't put into words. "I'm going to tell the truth," he said quietly. "Not right away, maybe, but eventually I'm going to tell the real story. About Dad, about the money, about all of it. I don't know what will happen, what people will think, but I'm tired, Sarah. I'm so tired of carrying stories that aren't completely true." "Then we'll tell the truth together," Sarah said, "and we'll deal with whatever comes. That's what partners do." They landed in Chicago near midnight, took a car service back to their building, rode the elevator up to their penthouse in comfortable silence. And when they walked through the door of their home, instead of retreating to separate corners of their life as they had so often in recent years, they sat together on the couch, overlooking the lake, talking about everything and nothing, until the sun began to rise over the water and a new day began. It wasn't a perfect ending. There would still be hard conversations ahead, difficult decisions to make about what to share and when, consequences to navigate as David's story changed and evolved. Their marriage would still require work, intentional effort to maintain the connection they had rediscovered through crisis. The world would still be complicated and messy and full of impossible choices. But they would face it together, as imperfect partners in an imperfect life, building something real on a foundation of truth. And that, Sarah thought as she watched her husband finally relax into sleep beside her as morning light filled their home, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And as their truth finally came into the open, one thing became clear. Healing always begins with honesty. No matter how strong we look on the outside, we all break somewhere. And we all deserve someone who sees us fully and loves us anyway. If this story touched you, like the story, comment what you learnt and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to stay with us. More powerful lessons, more healing journeys, and more stories that speak to the heart are coming. Don't miss the next one.